Hello, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you may be joining from. Welcome to this webinar on disability inclusive human resources, attracting, recruiting, and career fairs. My name is Brianna Harrison. I'm the Disability Inclusion Focal Point with DCO, and it's great to have you all here in this webinar. I am a female with red hair. I'm sitting in a room with a blue background, and I'm also wearing a blue scarf. I'd just like to go over a couple of housekeeping points before we get into the substance of this webinar. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the session in the chat box, and we will also have some time at the end for question and answer. But as you think of the questions, please feel free to raise them, and we'll do our best to respond during the webinar. If there are any questions that we don't get the opportunity to respond, we'll follow up after this meeting to make sure that all of the questions are answered. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording and additional resources after the webinar. We also have a live transcription, so you can turn that on through the webinar function. This webinar will cover the high impact service of inclusive HR, attracting and recruiting persons with disabilities, including through career fairs and job advertisements. To support operational management teams in UN country teams on how to collaborate and recruit and hire persons with disabilities. Next week, we will cover the topic of having an inclusive recruitment process, looking at reasonable accommodation and assessments of HR practices. This is part of a webinar series on high impact UN business operations, focusing on disability inclusion. I'd like to introduce the agenda and today's speakers. So as I mentioned, I'm Brianna Harrison with DCO. We then have Luis Diego Cobb and Heba Kolef from the Business Operations Services. Heba is a disability specialist, and they will share some information about high impact services to support operations colleagues on disability inclusion. We then have Gopal Mitra, Senior Social Affairs Officer from the Disability Inclusion Team in the Executive Office of the Secretary General, who will share a bit of information about the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy and the UN Country Team Accountability Scorecard. We're pleased to have Stefan Trommel, Senior Disability Specialist at the International Labour Organization, who will share an overview of inclusive HR practices and ways to implement this at the country level. We also have Amba Salsekar from the International Disability Alliance, who will share tips on how to work with organizations of persons with disabilities and provide the support needed to attract persons with disabilities. I'm also pleased to introduce Julianne Dennena and Gustavo Araujo from the UNHCR, who will speak on their experiences in the field with inclusive HR. I'd also just like to take a moment to thank and introduce the support team working in the organization from the EOSG and DCO. We also have been working with Georgia Dominic and Ino Efraimson. And I'm also pleased to introduce to you Leora Grassel, who is providing the live transcription. So before I pass the floor to Luis Diego, we're going to just launch a quick poll. So we look forward to seeing your responses. Hopefully you see the poll now on the screen. The question is, did your country office take steps in the last 2 years on inclusive recruitment of persons with disabilities? Yes, several steps. Yes, 1 to 2. none yet, or not sure. So we'll just give a few more seconds. We have 51% of people who have responded so far. Okay, we have now 58% of people who have responded. And it looks like the majority of respondents are saying that no steps have been taken as yet, but we have just less than a third of people who are not sure, and then we have about a quarter of the participants who responded yes, 1 to 2, and a very small number responding that their country teams have taken several steps. So we look forward to sharing with you more information so that we can get those numbers up. I'm going to pass now to Luis Diego to provide some more information on the high impact services.
So hi everyone, great to be here today. I'm Luis Diego Cobb. I'm a Latin person with black hair. I'm wearing a sort of a bluish shirt with a mirror, I think, behind me, or a frame. I'm sitting in Istanbul currently, but I'm based in New York, and I work with the Development Coordination Office in High Impact Common Services. As you may know, if you are from the operations side, you may have heard of the Business Operations Strategy, which is basically a framework that allows all UN entities to work together and collaborate for higher efficiencies. And higher efficiencies would create higher impact that we're defining in several categories, which we'll show in the next slide. The main categories are to be able to cut costs and increase the quality of services of operations. And while operations has traditionally been supporting programming, we also believe that it can be very impactful in the way that it does all the practices, processes, and whatnot, which are the other categories of high impact services. So services that are connected with either the SDG and the 2030 agenda, or good practices with entities. So whereas before one entity perhaps was working independently on disability inclusion, business operations strategy is an opportunity for those entities to work together and be able to really scale up good practices. And that's what we're wanting to do. And we're creating a proof of concept and working very closely with 16 countries to do that. And I'll introduce Heba Khalif, my colleague in DCO, in a second, who's supporting the implementation of those services. So in this slide also here, you see other areas that we have identified also as high impact in operations. So some of them is environmental sustainability, efficiency, energy efficiency, and installation of solar panels. And the other one is gender inclusion, from gender parity to prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, and gender responsive procurement. Particularly on disability inclusion, we're putting a lot of focus because we believe it's fundamental to the work that the UN does and to the work of leaving nobody behind, really. And we have divided it in 3 core areas in operations, one of them being inclusive HR, which we'll cover today, ICT accessibility, and physical accessibility, which we covered already. But particularly in inclusive HR, and it's great that we had the poll to see that there is an important or significant gap that we need to address, that we know is being addressed in different ways, and that we can improve and help fill much faster. So in inclusive HR, we have a few services that we created for the business operations strategy. So for operations colleagues to be able to scale, and ideally, as the goal, hire more persons with disabilities and be able to provide an inclusive environment for them to really thrive. So it's not enough to hire, but also know that they're, thriving on equal basis and are being able represented with their full rights, and advancing in their careers and leadership positions like everybody else. So on the first step here, going backwards, it's to identify and engage persons with disabilities. So we did that, covered that in the previous webinar. As number 2, it's mapping disability inclusive HR processes, which we will cover in this webinar. As number 3, it's orienting and training staff, so being able to address stigma, discrimination, and reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation we will cover a little bit now in this webinar. And number 4 is joint accessible UN career affairs and recruitment orientation, so being able to train and facilitate the recruitment process for persons with disabilities. As I mentioned, the goal and the 5th step is to be able to hire and provide that inclusive environment for persons with disabilities. So we know it's a short webinar and there are many resources. What we want to let you know is that we're here to support you to implement these, and that there's a big team behind the specialist that can help you do this in your country team, and to please reach out to us to do this. So with that, I'll hand over to Heba so she can introduce herself and the support that she's giving as well. Over to you.
Thank you, Lewis. I hope you could all hear me. I'm speaking to you from Egypt, from Cairo. I'm a person with visual impairment. I think there is an echo, just a second. So I'm a person with visual impairment, as I said. I am wearing a pink jacket with a pink headscarf, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I have worked in the field of digital accessibility for more than 20 years. I was working in the Library of Alexandria in Egypt in assistive technology, and then I moved to the German Development Organization, International Organization for International Cooperation, GIZ, and I worked there in disability inclusion. We were working with young people, especially capacity building of young people to be to create leaders with disabilities. My job here is mainly concerned with the digital accessibility and the ICT resources, how to make all the UNCT teams able to make their digital tools and platforms accessible through assessment, manual and automatic accessibility audits, and through creating policies and strategies that could help them identify the accessibility challenges that they might have, and also how to we provide provide concrete solutions that would enable them to overcome them. I also have, through my lived experience as a person with visual impairment, I experienced firsthand how the mapping the HR processes of in order to provide services and recruit persons with disabilities is very important, because a person with a disability might not have the same opportunities that their non-disabled peers have in finding job vacancies, in getting shortlisted, in getting interviewed. Some of the PWDs or persons with disabilities might refrain from applying for jobs in the UN, thinking that they might not have the necessary qualifications, or that they might not get the reasonable accommodations that they need. Or they feel they experience low self-esteem because, as I said, they don't get interviewed and shortlisted very often, especially in low middle income countries, and especially with women with disability, especially the intersectionality between gender and disability plays a vital role in finding and recruiting women with disabilities in many job postings. So I hope to be able to contribute with all the UNCT countries in order to improve the recruitment and the retention and the maintaining and promotion of persons with disabilities in the job vacancies in the different UNCT teams. Thank you very much, and over to you, Lewis.
Thank you, Heba. Right now, I'd like to hand over to Gopal Mitra. Senior Social Affairs Officer with the Executive Office of the Secretary General, who will give an overview of the UNDIS and the Accountability Scorecard. Over to you, Gopal.
Can you hear me, Luis Diego?
We can, perfectly.
Okay, brilliant. Hello, colleagues. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are logging in from. My name is Gopal Mitra. I'm from the EOHG Disability Inclusion team. Work along with Georgia, Dominic, and it's a pleasure to be on this webinar today. We work very closely with our colleagues in DCO, Brianna, Luis Diego, I know Amy, Heba, and so on, and also with many of our colleagues in the system, and Stefan Trommel is also here today, a great ally, colleague. So in the next few minutes, I'll be giving you an overview of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, which was launched by the Secretary General in June 2019, so just about 3 years back. And a lot of this work that we are doing, both in programs and operations, is working under, is happening under the umbrella of the strategy. Now, the strategy was launched by the Secretary General 3 years back to bring about lasting and transformative change on the work of the UN on disability inclusion, to ensure that the UN is fit for purpose on inclusion of persons with disabilities. But before I give you a flavor of the strategy, let me step back and briefly outline who are persons with disabilities, because that's the question we get almost in all webinars. So when we are talking about persons with disabilities in the strategy, in this webinar, and in our other work, we go by what the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities say. And according to the convention, persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, intellectual, psychosocial, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with institutional and environmental barriers prevent their participation in the society on an equal basis with others. So there are a couple of elements here which we got to note. One, persons with long-term physical, sensory, intellectual, and psychosocial impairment. And the operative word is the interaction with the barriers that exist. It's the interaction that prevents a full participation of persons with disability. And it's important to understand that this, because in all our work on disability inclusion, we should therefore, it's implied that we focus on addressing the barriers that exist, not creating new barriers to our work, but instead creating an enabling environment for persons with disability. And it is equally relevant when we are talking about HR services. So just going back to the strategy, it was launched in June 2019, 3 years back. The strategy covers all the 3 pillars of the UN's work. It covers both programs and operations. And the best part of the strategy is that it has an accountability framework with 2 components: an entity accountability framework, which UN agencies, entities implement and report, and a UN country team scorecard, which we are going to focus on today. Now, both these components of the accountability framework consist of concrete indicators with very specific benchmarks, which the UN system, both entities and country teams, are implementing and reporting on. Now, the strategy is also aligned with other system-wide strategies on gender, youth, etc. So let me now give you a flavor of the indicators of the strategy. Now, the country team scorecard, as I referred to a little while back, consists of 14 indicators that are clustered under 4 core areas. The first core area is leadership, strategic planning, and management. How is the leadership championing disability inclusion? Does our cooperation framework, common country analysis integrate disability inclusion meaningfully? Is our institutional setup adequate? The second cluster is inclusiveness. Are we consulting persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in course of our work? Are our premises accessible? Are digital content, as Hiba mentioned, accessible? And so on. Procurement, is it accessible? And is it factoring in accessibility for persons with disabilities? The third cluster is programming. To what extent are programs and projects, our monitoring and our joint initiatives are integrating disability inclusion? And the fourth cluster is super important. It talks about organizational culture. And here it talks about employment of persons with disabilities, capacity building, how disability inclusive our communications are. So today's webinar is focusing on inclusive HR services. Brianna, the next last slide. We are focusing on inclusive HR, and the indicator that is explicitly is linked to is the indicator on employment of persons with disability, and it has benchmarks like the UNCT adopting a diversity statement on inclusion on persons with disabilities, outreach to persons with disabilities in order to ensure even to be better placed to recruit persons with disabilities in the UN workforce. But as we all know, in order to ensure that more and more persons with disabilities are part of the UN's workforce, we also have to ensure that our processes, our premises are accessible, our HR processes are inclusive, we have reasonable accommodation provisioning, we have digital accessibility, and so on. Our procurement factors in inclusion. So they are all interlinked. And in course of all our work, it is fundamental that we work closely and consult and engage organizations of persons with disabilities, because it's not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do, because in many instances where within a country team, we may not have the requisite expertise on all areas. We know that organizations of persons with disabilities which are present in all countries often have a lot of knowledge, and they also know where we can, what expertise is available, how we can tap into it, and it is always a win-win situation to engage with organizations of persons with disabilities. And in course of today's webinar, there'll be more spoken on these. So I'll stop now. Happy to respond to any questions, and over to you, Luis Diego.
Unmute to start speaking.
Thank you so much, Gopal. And I think it gives a great overview of how this fits into the broader picture, for sure. And now I would like to hand over to Stefan Tromel, who is Senior Disability Specialist from ILO, who will walk us through some of the technical aspects as well of inclusive HR. Over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you, Luis Diego, and greetings to everybody. I'm talking to you from Geneva, headquarters of the ILO. I'm a male Caucasian with glasses and a gray beard and a bit long hair, also gray. I think it's fair to say that neither the UN, the UN and the ILO as part of it, we definitely are not yet the employer of choice of persons with disabilities that that Gopal was mentioning. We have, but this is exactly the purpose of this webinar, to start moving in that direction. I think with our experience, I would divide the challenge in two parts. One, we need to look at the process itself, the recruitment process, and then we need to think about how to make sure that people with disabilities are part of a recruitment process. Let me explain. If we consider the process when we start with a job vacancy, the first thing that we do in the ILO, but it's definitely not enough, is we include a reference that we welcome candidates with disabilities. We might also add other groups, but we definitely mention that we welcome candidates with disabilities. And although that not always leads to candidates with disabilities to apply for specific jobs, it is an important message. And we would always suggest that this welcoming message should go for all posting. We should not just think that person with disability can only do certain jobs. They can do all jobs, or there might be candidates for all jobs. So we should make it very clear that we welcome them for all positions. And I think it's also very important to complement that welcoming message by stating that if persons with disabilities require a reasonable accommodation to take part in the recruitment process, as Heba was mentioning, that we are ready to provide that accommodation. And at the same time, if a person is finally selected, that we would also be providing reasonable accommodation in the actual workplace. It's also very important that we carefully revise our e-recruitment platform. We have just done very recently that in the ILO recruitment platform, and we have identified a good number of barriers that people with different types of disabilities would encounter if they're trying on their own independently, as it should be, to apply for a job in the ILO. I think it's also important that some basic training is being given to all people that are involved in the recruitment process, starting by the person that probably would be in contact with a candidate who has signaled that he or she needs an accommodation. You probably will then need to enter into some discussions about how best to provide such an accommodation. And it's important that the person who will be in contact with that candidate knows the different types of accommodation, knows how to respectfully communicate with persons with different types of disabilities. Of course, also important that the recruitment panel is aware of disability awareness issue. For instance, is aware on how to communicate with a person who is on the neurodiversity autistic spectrum, who perhaps will not interact with the recruitment panel in the usual way, or in the way that we expect persons to communicate, but still might be an excellent candidate, but it's just not communicating in our expected way. Important also that we check on medical tests and medical forms, because there's still, at least some of the forms that are being used would include questions which, for instance, would not be good for people with psychosocial disabilities. So that is one, that's the first element, to really carefully revise our process to identify and eliminate any barriers that people with different types of disabilities might encounter. But then how do we make sure, because even if we eliminate all those barriers, we might still not get candidates with disabilities knocking on our doors for different reasons, like Heba explained, perhaps because there is a historic low expectation that the UN would be, in fact, finally being able to recruit people with disabilities. So I think it's very important to proactively, in all our outreach efforts, to include persons with disabilities. So if human resource departments from our entities are having specific strategies to identify talent in a specific country, to make very clear and visibly and explicitly show that that talent we also expect talented people with disabilities to apply. So if we organize career fairs, if we have materials where we present the UN to young people in the country to attract them, it would be good to explicitly refer to persons with disabilities and to show in those materials already colleagues with disabilities that are working within the UN. When we reach out to universities, whatever mechanism is used to identify talent at country level, to really specifically make it clear in those activities that we expect people with disabilities to apply. And it's very important, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment from another speaker, to specifically reach out to organizations of persons with disabilities, to identify the channels through which any job vacancy that could come from a UN entity at country level, to really make sure that it reaches possible candidates with disabilities through to the different means that organizations of persons with disabilities can have. It can be through their newsletters, through social media channels, etc., etc. Really proactively provide that information, and of course always ensuring that that information is also provided in an accessible way. I think it's also important to find ways to contribute to creating a pipeline of people with disabilities that gradually acquire the knowledge to be able to meet the entry requirements for the UN. It can be through junior professional officers. It can be by using by providing internships for persons with disabilities. It can be through voluntary schemes. There's now a scheme by UNDP and UNV to focus on volunteers with disabilities. It can be by employing consultants with disabilities, etc. So different ways in which we can bring gradually more people with disabilities closer to the UN, that better understand what the UN requirements are, and that gradually, by working with us, perhaps not initially already with long-term employment, to gradually acquire the knowledge that is needed to join us. And finally, just to say that we're looking at something that will require patience and resilience and insistence. It's not that we will from one day to the other significantly increase the numbers of persons with disabilities, but we need to systematically promote that, and we will see that over a rather short period of time, we will gradually, I hope so, increase the numbers of persons with disabilities working with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I think those are very concrete ways. We realize that there's a lot longer journey to go through, but it's a great start. And I think we can all start working towards that, again, with all the resources available. For now, I'd like to hand the floor over to Amba Salelkar, who is Senior Technical Advisor from the International Disability Alliance, who will also support us in giving some advice and the perspective from organizations. Over to you, Amba.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amba Salelkar. I have a short hair and I have a nose ring, and I'm very self-conscious about talking about myself. So that's as far as I'm going to go. I am a woman with psychosocial disability. As we mentioned, I work for the International Disability Alliance, and I'm based in the city of Chennai in India. And it is a really great opportunity to speak. I know one of my colleagues joined on Tuesday, and I'm really happy to share my perspectives as well. In my opinion, and from the programmatic work around inclusive employment that I have seen by virtue of working with IDA, working with organizations of persons with disabilities is a really great way to ensure that not only do you have a reach to their membership, but OPDs also create a great sounding board of sorts to find out whether the calls for applicants that you've drafted get the desired effect. We are quite happy, we have a lot of relationships with people from the United Nations who often send us job openings, which are on the increase actually. And we circulate them into our community of practice. So IDA runs several training programs, and we have a community of practice across the global South. But we are not really sure about how many of them actually get caught onto. And we wonder sometimes about how we could make that better. But coming back to OPDs, I think that one thing that's important with OPDs that you're working with, especially at the national level, because they often give much more insights as to, they have a much more wider membership that you could draw on to, that they're brought onto early in the process. But even if they are not brought into while drafting, your calls for applications, etc., it's still that when these calls are circulated, it's important that you have the largest possible lead time, because often for people with disabilities, it's a short deadline doesn't really work. You might have somebody who needs to support to update their CVs or their other documentation. People with disabilities often don't have the social capital to actually rely on to do things very quickly. And so these processes take time. What also may help is to have an open channel of communication, as opposed to a very impersonal sort of, a portal where people have to load documents onto, because often there is a fear that any responses or anything might be taken the wrong way. I speak to this from my experience as a woman with a disability who held my first salary job at the age of 36 or 37. Mainly because I had a lot of well-warranted apprehensions upon being able to thrive or work in a conventional job. particularly when I did not really have a language around reasonable accommodations for myself. And I know you guys will be talking about reasonable accommodations in the future, but recognizing that it's not a one-stop thing. It's not something that I can tell you today and it will never change. But for many of us, it is something that's continuously evolving. And that's something that recruitment processes also have to acknowledge. I think what's important, again, I think previous speakers have mentioned it, about questions around disability or health conditions can be taken the wrong way. I recall when I was applying for a course in the UK, I was asked whether I had a mental illness. And my first reaction was to panic and withdraw my application, which was funny because I had actually applied on the basis of my work on disability and mental health in India. But when I asked the university why they needed that information, and they made it clear that they wanted to do that so they could link me up to peer supports. And I think that makes a huge difference. So when people are asked questions without context, it kind of can be taken negatively, and it has been taken negatively in the past as well. I strongly believe that where you have TORs or job advertisements and you try and seek the opinion of people representing OPDs, you might get different perspectives on the efficacy of the documents that you're proposing. It's very well documented that where you have job advertisements, men, and I'm assuming these men without disabilities, apply even if they meet % of the requirements of the job. Whereas women will wait until they actually get closer to 100% for applying. And it's not far-fetched to expect that the statistics are the same for many persons with disabilities. We know this because we often coach our community of practice when it comes to job applications. And there is this overwhelming need for us as people with disabilities to be absolutely above the average standard, like it's the burden of popular culture. And it's something which, while I think it's extraordinarily important, like other speakers have mentioned, that we must say that we welcome persons with disabilities, but also to encourage people to apply, even if they don't feel that they meet all of the criteria, because often this might be a first step for them and they could be identified to do other roles within the organization, which are very important. Also to echo the fact that it's not always open calls that might get the best options, because often you have people with disabilities who need a little more exposure in order to suit themselves for roles. So working on a variety of alternatives like paid internships or like was mentioned before, consultations are actually also a really great way to do this. The last thing I want to mention as a practice that we've seen work is a recently concluded program on inclusive employment called Inclusion Works. This was a consortium project that was implemented in Bangladesh, Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. And in this project, it was around employment of persons with disabilities, but OPDs had a very, very strong role to play in this. And I'm going to just post 2 links in the chat, which demonstrate the roles of OPD engagement officers. So there were officers in the 4 countries who worked with OPDs on these issues, working as liaisons between employers and with OPDs in the countries to make sure that especially underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities were identified and encouraged to apply for jobs. So that's all from me. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. Really interesting and valuable contributions for us to consider. We're going to pass the floor now to Julianne Dennena, Senior Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and Gustavo Araujo, Head of Partnerships and Outreach from UNHCR. Thanks so much. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you to all of you. It's great. It's such an honor to be here with all of you and to talk about what we do in terms of inclusive HR services at UNHCR. And it was very refreshing and helpful to listen to the other panelists as they gave their experiences and talked about the processes they have in place. And what we'll talk about today very briefly is just this kind of two-part process that was mentioned earlier, the recruitment processes themselves and how UNHCR engages with persons with disabilities through organizations for persons with disabilities and our own colleagues. So I'll hand over first to Gustavo, and then I'll pick up just at the very tail end.
Thank you very much, Julianne. It's a pleasure being here with all of you. My name is Gustavo Araujo. I'm a male with brown hair, wearing a black shirt. I have a blurred background right behind me. I'm originally from Brazil, and as Julianne mentioned, I'm the head of HR partnerships and talent outreach at UNHCR. I started my job at UNHCR about a year ago, 13 months pretty much. So my experience is limited, but I think we've made good progress when it comes to little by little making steps that would make hopefully big change in the future. And the main item that we focused on was literally building capacity across our colleagues. If you don't mind moving the slide, I can see if the slide is actually on the screen at this point. We have a few items to show. I think we're going to the slide that's listed as activities rather than slide that's listing talent outreach. So just a brief summary of what my unit does, besides managing partnerships with all kinds of partners across the UN system and private sector, and also governments, we also manage talent outreach for the organization. However, as you know, we have limited resources to do all of that. So what we typically do is we focus on enhancing capacity. So our goal is to support the organization in attracting, engaging, and hiring talent from across the globe. If you're managing the slides, if you don't mind moving 3 times, 2 more, 1 more, perfect. Back one. Back one, that's it. Thank you very much. So the first thing that we have done, starting, you can go forward. In the past year, we have strengthened our relationship with our disability and inclusion peers to ascertain that we find synergies with their work and better promote UNHCR as an employer of choice. And an important component of this was to engage with those members to help them gain skills to support the promotion of job opportunities and the promotion of the mandate of the organization to members of their own network. We started with conducting a 3-session workshop aimed at giving these individuals the basics on UNHCR employer branding and helping them understand how to leverage social media if possible, and also create a roster, develop networks to promote the organization as an employer of choice. Obviously, we're talking to individuals who may have disabilities themselves or be caregivers or related to close or be champions to persons with disabilities overall. Another important factor is looking at the recruiters and the individuals who work as HR practitioners at the organization. So we also conducted training sessions for our colleagues across the organization. In the past year, we've trained about 150 individuals. And our goal is to make sure that they themselves were able to pass on the message, understand the message, and be able to better promote opportunities to persons of disabilities by speaking the proper language as much as possible, by understanding the potential issues that persons with disabilities, depending on their unique cases, may suffer or may withstand based on the difficulties that they may find in applying for positions at the UN. And we also, as part of the training, distributed resources and key messages, including but not limited to the focus on the skills and abilities required for the job throughout the process, and not necessarily focus on accommodation. Obviously, we tell them to focus on accommodation when it comes to the recruitment process. When we are engaging with candidates, the focus shouldn't be on whether or not they have the disability, but on whether or not they have the skills and abilities to do the job. So making sure that we provide this kind of information and experience to the applicants. If you want to move to the next slide, and then I am almost done. This prep work was referred to our participation in career fairs. At this point, it was during COVID, so virtual career fairs at that point. And we held multiple sessions to actually prepare the recruiters prior to engaging in these career fairs to make sure that they felt comfortable with engaging with the content in a proper way. One thing that I noticed when I moved to UNHCR is that there were a lot of recruiters who felt uncomfortable with the idea about making mistakes, making faux pas, not understanding exactly how to communicate the employer value proposition of the organization to niche audiences, including persons with disabilities as well. So the idea was to make sure that we also provided guidelines on disability inclusive language, so that these could be followed in the way that we promote our vacancies and in the job descriptions and in the way that we talk about the organization overall. And we are continuing our engagement with other UN agencies, particularly UNDP, which is doing quite a great job in engaging with persons with disabilities in multiple programs. And we're in touch with them about finding out more how we can align their practices with ours when it comes to internships and hopefully JPOs in the future. This is just a brief sample, and I think it aligns very well with the idea that we start at the bottom, we start at the base in order to build capacity and understanding, so people in HR and champions overall can become real champions for individuals of diverse backgrounds. Thank you for that, and I pass the buck to Julianne.
Thanks, Gustavo. So picking up just very briefly, I wanted to linger a little bit on UNHCR's processes for the accommodation and adjustment for the recruitment process. And when I say recruitment, we're looking at testing and interviewing. So right now, we are at the cusp where we'll move into a more automated system. But applicants with disabilities can directly write to our colleagues in recruitment, asking for what their needs are for the testing and interviewing phases. And that information doesn't necessarily go with their application, but when they are shortlisted for any interview or test, then the HR person following along will contact that person to find out more about what exactly is needed. But they'll be alerted already here by emails that potential applicants can send to UNHCR. And in that vein, when our new system does go live in just a few weeks, actually, it will be more automated. So already at the application phase, applicants can say when accommodation or adjustments are needed for testing and interviewing, and that information will go directly to the HR colleague, the HR practitioner who manages those vacancies. It won't be seen by managers, but it will go directly to the people supporting the process. What I also wanted to mention too was, just as Gustavo raised, was our resource group, our employee resource group, the Disability Inclusion Resource Group, who was very much involved with the processes as we put these together. So in terms of our outreach and working with partners for career fairs for persons with disabilities, our colleagues with disabilities were involved by sharing a profile. And if you could skip to the next slide, please. So we had featured colleagues for those career fairs. They were invited also to participate in the career fairs, so they could be directly available to applicants when they participated in the career fair to answer any questions. And having their profiles available at the forefront and then being part of the actual career fairs actually boosted their confidence. They came back later to say that they were thrilled at being part of the process, and they were able to talk. They were able to talk a little bit more about what it's like to work with a disability for UNHCR, where they are in their field operations or in their offices. So it created a lot more connection within the organization and generated a lot more empathy and understanding across the board. And we were thrilled to have that possibility in working with them. And you see here, just when it says featured colleagues, this is just a very brief snapshot of what was put up online as people signed up for the career fairs. One colleague already speaking about about his experience in UNHCR, which was made available. The other thing that we do from the career fairs is that their questions are collected when the HR practitioners can't respond to their specific specific questions. So those questions are collected, sent to either me or our colleagues in medical services who adjudicate requests for workplace accommodation. And collectively, the answers to their questions are collected and sent back to the participants in our career fairs. And just one success story built on this process, we had a colleague who is a caregiver who was able to impact the process and ensure that the applicants with disabilities were considered for a specific vacancy that she was overseeing. And because of her direct action, now we have that colleague working with us who was first part of the national group, national, I don't like the word category myself, but among our national colleagues, and has now moved to, has become an international colleague. So we were super happy to see the impact that this process has had on our colleagues and the connection it's made. And just as a last footnote, UNHCR also has what we call the Disability Inclusive guide for testing and interviewing, where our HR practitioner colleagues can find guidance for putting adjustments in place during testing and interviewing. And I'll stop there. And thanks again, everyone. Any questions, we're happy to answer.
Thank you so much to Julianne and Gustavo. Really, really interesting to hear about the very, very concrete steps that you have taken and all of the expertise in UNHCR on this issue, both within your teams and that you have built across the staff. So I'd like to open the floor now to questions. The participants, please raise your hand if you'd like to take the floor. You can ask questions directly to any of the speakers or more generally, and we'd be happy to then facilitate that. So please do raise your hand. And I see in the chat that there's a question from Catherine. Can we have access to the UNHCR guide on recruitment for persons with disabilities? So maybe while we are waiting for other colleagues to indicate if they want to take the floor, Julianne or Gustavo, I don't know if you can respond on that one already.
Sure, we'd be very happy to share it. There's nothing confidential in it, but please, when you do go through it, it's very specific for the UNHCR context. But the overall lessons we hope can apply across the board. And then I guess I'll see with you, Brianna, what the modalities can be for sharing it.
Excellent, thank you so much. It sounds fascinating. I look forward to seeing it. I don't see any other colleagues raising their hands, so maybe I will just give an opportunity for some of our other colleagues to maybe come in with any additional reflections or guidance that they have. So I'll pass the floor first to Heba and then to Gopal. So Heba, without wanting to put you on the spot, I know you've been quite active in the chat. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this discussion? We have just a couple more minutes.
Just in case, Heba, we can't hear you.
Or perhaps.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for giving me the floor again. And I want to stress that no one can ever deny the importance and significance of organizations of persons with disabilities in the inclusion of people with disabilities in the society and especially in employment. However, it differs from one country to another. Some countries like Egypt, for instance, have the organizations of people with disabilities, like they are service-based entities, and they tend to offer services only to persons with disabilities. They don't play an active role in the community involvement. So that this results on the in the further isolation of people with disabilities. They are not integrated fully in society, even when they are trying to do career fairs for to employ people with disabilities. They do a career fair for persons with disabilities. This could be good as a positive discrimination kind of approach, but only if they do it using the twin track approach, like they do with disabilities, but at the same time they mainstream persons with disabilities in the mainstream. They include them in the mainstream career fairs. One other thing is that some people whom I personally have interacted with in many organizations, they have lower expectations for people with disabilities. They think that they work in certain jobs, you know, like visually impaired, they can work as teachers or or work in the telesales or something like that. They are not still ready to open up new venues for persons with disabilities to apply. So what I'm saying is that working with organizations of people with disabilities is wonderful. And if they can also collaborate with universities and take the potential high calibers from universities and try to do an internship to them in the different UN entities, this will expose them to a new high level of job opportunities, of learning opportunities, of interacting with society, and they can themselves, these these people with disabilities, these students with disabilities, can then form DPOs to work to form DPOs, and this will strengthen the role of DPOs in societies where the role of DPOs is in itself marginalized. Thank you very much for giving me the time to explain that, and I hope I didn't take a long time, and the floor is back to you, Brianna. Thank you.
Thank you, Heba. That's super helpful. Gopal, the last couple of minutes to you for any sort of concluding observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you, colleagues. I think it was a very practical discussion, and Heba, your jaws is. In a couple of things, I think it is a step-by-step process. It's a journey. We may not make overnight go from 0 to 10, but what I always see and feel, and what I see as making a difference is if we take it as the UN as step-by-step process. Okay, we do not have currently any persons with disabilities in our office. Can we in the next 6 months have at least 1 or 2 persons with disabilities, and we identify those the roles. And a related point is that often I've seen colleagues visualizing that persons with disabilities will do only disability specific role. It's not that. Persons with disabilities can do any role, and it is time and that persons with disabilities will do more roles within the UN that has nothing to do with disability inclusion. I mean, of course, they will nothing to do specifically with disability inclusion. Of course, every role in the UN disability inclusion can be factored in. So it's a step-by-step process. We need to build partnerships. I think Heba mentioned it. Our colleagues from Unhcr, everyone, it has come out very clearly. Partnerships with organizations of persons with disabilities. I think partnerships also with the corporate sector. What we see is the corporate sector, they are ahead of us in this game. You know, they are ahead of us in terms of employing persons with disabilities and creating an enabling environment for persons with disabilities. So in this case, we have a lot to we can learn from the private sector in countries. So step-by-step process, persons with disabilities will do are suitable for multiple roles, which are not disability specific, to say the least, and also partnerships with organizations of persons with disabilities, primarily NGOs working on persons on rights of persons with disabilities, and the private sector. It's a combination of these, I think, will be able to embark on this journey and see success step by step. Over to you, Brianna.
Thank you, Gopal. I think really important reminders that that we are all on a journey together, and we move step by step. And I'd like to thank so much our colleagues from other parts of the UN system who have taken the time today to come together and share some of their experience and resources and advice. Thanks also to the colleagues in the BOSS team for setting up this webinar. We are all here to sort of continue to respond to any questions that you may have. And we look forward to walking with you on this journey. So thanks so much to everyone, and have a good rest of the day or afternoon or evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.